Now, many historians are going to consider World War II, which officially starts in 1939 and ends in 1945, as a continuation of the First World War. Now, the First World War, guys, ended with the Treaty of Versailles. It's going to be a horrible peace for the Germans. It's going to punish them severely, and it's going to be basically a cause and effect kind of thing that's going to lead into the Second World War and reasons for it. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, kind of the reasons for World War II, what led up to it, and kind of which direction the war took once the war actually started. Now, at the Peace of Versailles, one of the stipulations in there is that a democratic government will be put in place in Germany. All right, so this was known as the Weimar Republic, which is going to last all throughout the 1920s. And the Weimar Republic is pretty much marred by economic problems. One of the major reasons why Germany can't get it together in the 1920s, and they seemingly have this weak democracy, is the fact that the war reparations that they had to pay to the Allies was very, very high. So in an attempt to pay on time and to kind of pay their bills, basically, the Weimar government is going to print more money. And obviously, if you know anything about economics, if you print more money and there's nothing necessarily backing it up, you're going to create massive inflation. So you're going to have stifling inflation in Germany in between the wars here, and people are going to be economically disenfranchised. It gets so bad that by 1922, there are 4 billion marks to $1 US is how bad it gets. So that's an insane amount of an exchange rate, if you think about it, 4 billion to $1. And so the German mark in the 1920s was so worthless that kids would just bundle it up and make toy blocks out of it, or people would just burn it for fuel because it was more economical than going out and buying fuel with trillions of marks in your possession. But what this is going to mean to the Germans is that this democracy that they've chosen has kind of failed them in a way. And they're going to turn to other options in the 1930s. So we got to look at Germany in the 1920s and 30s to fully understand why they go for Adolf Hitler. And so they're just a disenfranchised population. Now, people are going to turn to fascism in the 1920s and in the 1930s. And fascism, if you know what the political spectrum is far right on the political spectrum, where communism would be far left on the political spectrum. So you got to understand, with fascism, you're going to have a fascist dictator in charge, somebody who is efficient and get things done, basically. So you have to understand why the German people are going to choose Adolf Hitler, why they choose to put all their trust and hopes in a dictator. And you got to understand that prior to World War II, the term dictator, all right, didn't necessarily carry the negative association that we have today. We in 2015, 2016, look back at the Second World War and dictators as being this great evil, all right, but people in the 1930s saw fascism as a legitimate alternative to democracy. All right, so democracy, the Weimar Republic had failed the German people. They were under threat of communist Bolshevik takeover from the left, and there were many Germans who didn't want to be communist, and they didn't want to continue to be in this democracy that wasn't working for them. So along comes a right-wing regime, Adolf Hitler, who appeals to them, all right, who promises them strength and stability and being proud to be German again. So you have to understand, this is before the Holocaust. This is before any of that actually took place. So a lot of Germans are turning to this to kind of pull Germany out of this rut. The picture here is of the 1937 Studebaker dictator. Studebaker was an American car company that produced a make of car known as the Dictator. So it just goes to show you that in the 1930s, the word dictator kind of hearkened to ancient Rome with Julius Caesar and Cincinnatus and people who were efficient and got things done and were decisive. So never today would you ever see an American car company, using the name dictator for, one of their makes. So it's just kind of an interesting little fact. Now, if we look at Europe, it seemed like in the 1920s and 30s, people were choosing extreme forms of government, either taking far right fascist regimes or going left to communism. So there was not a lot of middling ground, if you would. Again, democracy seemed to have failed a lot of these countries, or their attempts at democracy, and they were looking for stability, and they were definitely looking for someone to counter the communist threat. So if we look at other European countries right before World War II breaking out in 1939, you're going to have Portugal, Spain, and Italy, more famously, have fascist regimes in place. Spain went through a civil war to achieve the ascension of Francisco Franco, who will remain in power as a fascist dictator until 1975. So, it had a long-lasting effect on Europe for sure. Now, Benito Mussolini is going to be Hitler's biggest ally in Europe. They're going to create basically the Rome-Berlin axis once the war gets going. But Mussolini had it in his head that he was going to make Italy into the Roman Empire again. And he uses fascist themes and styles in his speech that get the people riled up into like this nationalistic frenzy. So, there's two different camps basically in Europe for sure. Now, Germany is going to democratically elect Adolf Hitler, who's not going to give up power after he takes it in the early 1930s. But he runs on this whole platform that he's going to try to restore German pride, that the Versailles Treaty that the Germans signed in 1919 is complete and utter nonsense, that they need to reform it, or that they just need to ignore it. And part of ignoring the Versailles Treaty was having an army. So he actually rearms and recreates the German Army and Air Force in violation of the treaty. So he declares a Third Reich, all right, and this Reich was supposed to last 1,000 years. Now, on top of this, there was oftentimes, a base of racism in this regime. Hitler espoused that the Germans were the master race, and that they had to preserve that purity, that racial purity that they were trying to achieve, and that Germans were the most pure race. So he's going to institute what's known as the Nuremberg Laws, which is kind of the first sign in Nazi Germany that Jews are going to have it very rough and have it discriminated against them, and inevitably lead to the Holocaust. So it's just steps towards the final solution, which will be, the extermination of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. Now, in the early 1930s, Hitler's going to restore German pride, and a lot of this pride comes from the growth of the German military. So he expands the army, expands military production, industrial military production, builds the Navy, builds a German Air Force, and this is in direct violation of the Versailles Treaty. But the Western democracies of France and Great Britain do nothing to stop Hitler. So he's going to see how far he can push the envelope here in the 1930s. His first kind of testing the waters is he's going to occupy what's known as the Rhineland. If you look at the map on the left there, in the western part of Germany, that was supposed to be a demilitarized zone according to the Versailles Treaty, and the Germans weren't allowed to have any kind of a police force, or certainly not a military force there. So in 1936, Hitler occupies the Rhineland with his army, with the Wehrmacht, and basically, again, though, the Western Allies don't do anything. The Western Allies of France, or democracies of France and Great Britain, don't really have a stomach for another fight. Remember, this is less than 20 years after the First World War. Nobody really wanted to, go to war against Germany again, just to make sure that they were following these treaty lines. So Hitler continues to take territory. He takes Austria in 1935. In the lower red area at the bottom part of Germany. He claims that Austria should be part of a greater German Reich. Then he's going to take what's called the Sudetenland, which is the area around Czechoslovakia in the pink in color. And the Sudetenland, Hitler claimed, was an area that was mostly German speakers, so he wanted to make that into his Reich. So he wanted to create a German-speaking Reich, so he took over all these lands where there were German speakers. And again, the Western democracies do nothing. So he goes even farther. The rest of Czechoslovakia. Okay, and by that point, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain decides to meet with Hitler, and basically Chamberlain says, you can't take these territories over. Hitler says, well, I'm done taking over any more territories. I've created my Reich. I won't take over anymore. So Chamberlain's like, all right, sounds pretty good, and he flies back to London, and where he famously says that we've achieved peace in our time. And he had this meeting with Hitler, and it went very well, and he doesn't think Hitler's going to do anything else. And that was September 1938. So that was a year before World War II breaks out. So no peace was achieved in their time. Now, on September 1st, 1939, Hitler's going to invade Poland. He's going to cross the Polish border frontier with his highly mechanized Wehrmacht. What a lot of people don't realize is at the same time, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. Hitler and Stalin had agreed that they were, going to basically carve up Poland, that Germany was going to invade. They were going to take 2/3 of it, and that the Russians could have the other third. So the Germans invade Poland, and this is the final straw for the Western Allies. The British and the French issue an ultimatum to Hitler saying that he needs to evacuate Poland with his military forces. Hitler ignores the ultimatum, and France and Britain declare war on Germany. So the Germans are utilizing an entirely new style of fighting. They did not want to be bogged down in the trenches like they had in the First World War. Nobody wanted to be in the trenches again. So the Germans used what was called Blitzkrieg, which is lightning war. And this is warfare based on mobility. That mobility is the way to fight a modern war. And Blitzkrieg also utilizes all your different forces moving in sync to achieve military success on the battlefield. This includes your infantry troops moving in sync with your armored units, your panzer divisions, with your dive bombers, all moving as one to achieve quick, fast victory. Now, they overtake Poland in a matter of days. The Polish cavalry was actually still in existence, and they actually met the German tanks on the field of battle. So the Poles were really no match for the Germans. But this is the official start of World War II. So that was September 1939. Between September and the spring of 1940, not a lot really happens. The Western Allies, like Britain and France, wait for the Germans to come. They have constructed the Maginot Line on the eastern part of France, waiting for the Germans to come. And nothing really happens throughout the winter of 1939-1940. This is called the Phony War, this anticipation building. And then finally, in the spring of 1940, the Germans blitzkrieg and invade into or through the Argonne Forest, the Ardennes. And the Allies thought that the Ardennes was too impenetrable, that it couldn't, it was too many forests and too much nature that tanks can't get through and what have you. But Hitler's going to roll right through the wooded area into France, and he's going to take Paris by early summer 1940. So France falls. The British Expeditionary Force that's in France has to retreat to a place called Dunkirk, where they're evacuated by civilian ships and the Royal Navy and taken back to Great Britain. So the British barely get out with a large majority of their army, barely escape. So it's now the British alone against Hitler. Now, as you can see, by December of 1941, on the picture there on the right, most of Europe is under Hitler's domination, with few exceptions. The Irish, the Swedes, the Spanish, the Swiss, the Turks, declaring neutrality. Portugal, but for the most part, they've come under this control of the control of the Third Reich. So France is going to fall by the spring of 1940. As I already stated before, the USSR and the Germans were kind of working together to some degree because they carved up Poland together. And Hitler and Stalin had signed what was called a non-aggression pact, which means we're just going to try to leave each other alone. But Hitler had it in his mind that he was always going to attack the Soviet Union. He saw the Soviets as, or the Slavic peoples, the Russians, the Poles, as subhuman on a racial scale, and he also hated communism. The biggest enemy of a fascist is a communist. So war between the Soviet Union and the USSR is pretty much going to be inevitable. But in 1940, after France falls, it's going to be Great Britain standing alone against Hitler. So Hitler makes plans for an invasion of Great Britain. Now, Great Britain had not been successfully invaded since 1066, so it's been a long time coming. But Hitler knows that before he can go through with Operation Sea Lion, which was his planned invasion of the British Isles, he needed to take control of the air. He needed to win the skies over Britain. So he's going to send his Luftwaffe to fight the British over London. This dogfighting over Great Britain is going to kind of turn into the Germans at first accidentally dropping bombs on British cities. And then the British are going to retaliate and start dropping bombs on German cities. And then the Germans are going to go full-on attacking major British cities again in retaliation. So it becomes a different kind of war where civilian populations are targeted, cities are targeted. So the Battle of Britain rages on between the RAF, that's the Royal Air Force, and Hitler's Air Force over the skies of Great Britain. Now the British are going to utilize a new technology, which was radar, which they set up these radar stations along their coast, so they knew when the German squadrons were coming. So they would scramble their fighters and meet the Germans in the air. And for a while there, the Germans didn't know what was happening, how they knew exactly where they were going to be. But the Battle of Britain is going to rage on, and it's going to be a British victory. The Germans can never take control of the skies over Great Britain. And as Winston Churchill famously said, in regards to the RAF pilots who saved Great Britain, never had so much been owed to so few by so many, referring that the fact that the British people owed a tremendous amount of gratitude to these fighter pilots that saved Great Britain. So because he can never take control over the skies of Great Britain, he can never invade Great Britain, and the Royal Navy has a chokehold on the channel. So Hitler's going to have another plan. He's got to find another enemy, and that enemy is going to be the USSR. Now, the other Axis aggressor in World War II would have been was the Japanese. As you can see on the right there, by early 1942, the Japanese Empire is going to expand over a tremendous amount of territory in the Pacific Ocean. Now, the Japanese were a modern fighting force in the Pacific, and they're going to, early on in the 1930s, start encroaching into Manchuria and different parts of China. China was involved in a civil war at the time between the Republic and the Marxist, and so they were already weakened. So the Japanese are going to take advantage of this and take over large portions of China and port towns along the coast there. So the Japanese home islands don't have a lot of natural resources. They don't have a lot of rubber. They don't have a lot of oil, petroleum. So a lot of the motivation for taking over this territory was raw resources. Manchuria is very rich in coal and in iron, which the Japanese needed. And a lot of the places that they're going to take over once war starts with the Western powers are going to give them these resources that they need. French Indochina is going to have the rubber plantations for their military machine, and also Burma with the oil fields. So to take these territories, though, guys, they're going to have to take them from the Western countries that already control these colonies. So you're going to have basically the Japanese taking advantage of what's going on in Europe and France falling, and they're going to take French Indochina, and then in 1941 Burma, Siam, the Philippines, and this brings the Western countries into the fight. Obviously, the Americans become involved in the fighting because of the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. This brings the United States into war against Japan. A couple days later, the Germans declare war against the United States. So now you've got a global struggle going on between the two sides. But the Japanese Empire is very, very extensive. Now, the United States is going to have a policy on how they're going to win a victory against the Japanese, and they're going to start this campaign of island hopping across the Pacific. Now, the first island that they hop to is Guadalcanal at the bottom right-hand part of the map. This is the first island in a string of many islands, each one getting closer and closer to the British Isles. I'm sorry, the Japanese home islands. And it's going to be a bloody struggle hopping from island to island and take a very long time. But the Americans and the British want to get into range of Japan, because once they get close enough to islands close enough to Japan, they can then, bomb Japan from those islands. Now, with Hitler not able to take Great Britain, he turns his attention to the Soviet Union. Now, again, the Soviets and the fascists are natural enemies. They're on opposite ends of the political spectrum, and it was only a matter of time before they would fight each other. Hitler said it in his book Mein Kampf that, he saw the Russians and other Eastern Europeans as subhuman, so it was only a matter of time. Hitler also wanted to create what he called living space for the German people, and he wanted to conquer large areas of Russia to do this, to create a greater German Reich and living space for his Aryan population. So he gets the idea that he's going to invade Russia, the Soviet Union. So he masses his army along the border. He read the history books. He knew what Christopher the 12th had done and failed, and what Napoleon had done and failed. And Hitler probably thought to himself that Napoleon didn't have mechanized panzer units and dive bombers, and I do. So this should be pretty easy. So in June of 1941, he invades, and this was called Operation Barbarossa. So he invades and pushes deep into the Soviet Union, this basically surprise attack on the Soviets, and the Soviets just aren't ready for it, and they retreat. Stalin himself, the leader of the Soviet Union, retreats to one of his beach houses, basically, and hides in the house for days on end, and doesn't take phone calls, doesn't respond to anybody trying to get in touch with him, has like a mental breakdown, a nervous breakdown, and it takes him a couple weeks before he pulls it together and addresses the Soviet people, trying to get them rallied to fight the Nazis. But this is going to be a very, very destructive part of the war. When the Germans take over territory, they oftentimes slaughter large portions of the populations that they capture. Civilians get caught in the crossfire. Once the Soviet Union starts to push the Germans back and then take over German territory, they retaliate on the German population in the same way that the Germans kind of dealt with their population. So this is going to be a very destructive field or front on the war. When it's all said and done, there's going to be about 29 million people dead on the Eastern Front alone in World War II, which is a staggering amount of people. So it's really a fight for the death. It's both sides fighting because they know that the other side is trying to exterminate them. So it's a whole new kind of warfare that we have going on here. But this is Hitler's downfall in a lot of ways, because even though the Soviet Union was not prepared for the initial invasion, it's going to wake up the full industrial military might of the Soviet Union. That's eventually going to be unstoppable and is going to push the Germans all the way back to Berlin. Now, the Americans and the British and Canadians in Europe are going to start a campaign in North Africa, in which they're going to be pushing the Nazis back across the deserts of North Africa, fighting General Rommel in the desert, and eventually they're going to move up the coast of North Africa. Then they're going to invade Sicily. All right, and if you see the map there, they're going to move up the Italian peninsula, and the fight on the Italian peninsula is pretty brutal. Hitler sees it as a narrow landmass in which he can basically put a cork in this Allied advance. On top of that, Mussolini, Hitler's buddy, in this Rome-Berlin axis is pretty much worthless at this point. So what you have in Italy is Germans fighting to prop up the Italian fascist state. But the Allies are slowly going to push up the Italian peninsula. By June of 1944, they take the city of Rome. To give you an idea of where they're going. Now, in June Also in June of 1944, the British and the Americans and Canadians are going to invade Normandy, France, on June 6, 1944, as you can see from the map. So they're going to open up another front in northern France. It's going to allow them to push onto Germany. So the Germans are surrounded on three ends, if you look at it. The Soviet Union coming in from the east looking for revenge, the Americans and British in northern France, and coming up through Italy. So by the end of 1944 into early 1945, it's basically the end game for Germany. Now, the Germans are going to be pushed back from both sides, as I already stated. They have one last final offensive at what's called the Battle of the Bulge on the Western Front in the December of 1944. But after the British and the Americans push that back, it's a nonstop advance basically onto Berlin. So if you look at the map on the left, this is what the front lines basically looked like in May of 1945. The pink areas occupied by the Allies, and the red areas where the fighting's still going on. Now, the initial pushes towards Berlin, both the Soviets, the Americans, and the British, have this goal that they're marching on Berlin, that they're moving towards Berlin. But Berlin is in the eastern part of Germany. And the Western Allies anticipate that taking Berlin's going to be, if they try to push on to Berlin, that they're going to lose a lot of people, and the casualty rate will not be worth it. So they decide to let the Soviets take Berlin. Now you're going to have the major leaders of the Soviet Union, United States, and Great Britain meeting at Yalta and the Potsdam Conference to decide what to do with Germany once this war is over. And they're pretty much writing up the post-war plans. Now, so already there's tension between the Soviet Union and the West as to how this post-war world is gonna look. So it's really the beginnings of the Cold War in a lot of ways. Now, Berlin finally falls to the Red Army. They take it, they capture it, and basically you can see in the picture there kind of the famous image of a Red Army soldier putting the Soviet flag over the Reichstag in Berlin. But it was totally devastated. The Berlin population was, destroyed, killed. There were kids fighting, trying to save the city, and people holding on to, what was left of the Third Reich. Hitler is going to be held up in his bunker right under the Reichstag in the heart of Berlin, and he's going to be able to hear the Red Army and the bombs going off above him. He decides to marry his long-term girlfriend, Eva Braun. They get married in a quick ceremony, have champagne, few witnesses, and then they decide to go into the back room, take cyanide capsules, and shoot themselves. So Hitler commits suicide. Once he's out of the way, it's only a matter of days before the German leadership surrenders to the Allies, to the Red Army and the Western Allies. Now, a number of prominent Germans, German scientists and what have you, are fleeing from the Red Army to go surrender to the Americans and the British. A lot of the German population was doing that. They were fleeing to the west to escape the Soviet march west, because the Soviets were taking such revenge on the German population, murder, rape, plundering different towns. So it was pretty awful to be caught in the Soviet advance. Now, the American island hopping campaign in the Pacific is going to lead the American Navy, Marines, and Army Air Force closer and closer to the Japanese home islands. But with the Americans taking Iwo Jima, this puts the Americans in bombing range of Japan to a degree. And the last final major island that they take is Okinawa. And Okinawa is considered one of the Japanese home islands, even though it's really far off the coast. But by taking these two islands, it allowed the Americans to take their B 29 bombers that you see in the picture there and fly round-trip missions to Tokyo and, firebomb the city and then come back. So the war is coming to the Japanese. Now, in March 1945, Curtis LeMay of the Army Air Force is going to have this idea that the bombing runs in Japan are going to be more frequent. We're going to use incendiary bombs, napalm, and things like that to, bring the Japanese into submission. So in the spring of 1945, there's massive amounts of bombing going on of Japanese cities, firebombing going on, and a lot of the structures in the Japanese cities were very flammable. Wood, paper, that kind of thing. So what we're going to have here after this initial bombing campaign by the United States in March 1945, more people are going to be killed, more Japanese are going to be killed than in the 2 atomic bomb blasts that occur later on that summer. So, it's total war in the truest sense of the word. Now, the Americans and the British were to get, or wanted to get, unconditional surrender out of Japan. And basically what that means is you have no condition. If you surrender to us, you have no conditions in what happens. So obviously that's more of a strict kind of demand to take, and the Japanese weren't willing to necessarily surrender unconditionally here when we had the beginning of the summer of 1945. But as they're inching closer to Japan, it's expected that the United States and Britain will have to invade Japan, the home islands themselves. And by September of 1945, they figured they were ready to do this. On top of that, it was agreed at the Potsdam Conference that once Hitler was out of the way, the Soviet Union would go to war with Japan as part of the agreement with their allies. So what we're going to have happen in the summer of 1945 is the Red Army invading Manchuria and fighting the Japanese in China. So now the United States had to deal with this the idea that if the Soviet Union invades Japan and the United States and Britain invade Japan, it might be a divided Japan, just like we have a divided Germany. So there's this whole thread of what the post-World War is going to look like. So the United States had been developing, and so had a lot of other countries, or trying to develop an atomic bomb. It was called the Manhattan Project, and many scientists in the United States were working on it in desert labs in New Mexico. And in the summer of 1945, you're going to have what's called the Trinity tests, in which the first atomic bomb blast going off in a New Mexico desert with these tests. So the Americans now have a new weapon that's more destructive than anything else before it. They have a B-29, which is a big enough plane to deliver such a heavy bomb. And so now President Truman, who's president after Franklin Delano Roosevelt died in April 1945, President Truman's going to have the decision. Is the United States going to use this bomb on Japan, or should we invade Japan conventionally? A lot of people thought that an invasion of Japan would not only kill more Americans, but it would also kill more Japanese who are willing to defend their home to the death. The Japanese government was arming women and children with bamboo spears that they had sharpened, waiting to defend their home, basically. So President Truman decides the best course of action is to drop the bombs on the Japanese. On top of that, it was the idea that the Russians might invade Japan in the post-war Japan looking like more of a post-war Germany. So a lot of people think that the motivation for it to do it really quickly in August of 1945 was to keep the Russians out of Japan. So the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Hiroshima roughly the size of the city of Pittsburgh, is targeted, and the Japanese, the Americans still want Japanese to surrender unconditionally. After 2 atomic bombs, a lot of them are still not ready to surrender unconditionally. After this, the Japanese have one condition in the peace process, and that's that the United States does not get rid of the Japanese emperor. All other points they're okay with. So the Americans decide that's the one condition they can take. All right, and the Japanese are officially going to surrender to the Western Allies on September 2nd, 1945, on board the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Now, what this creates, though, is, this new bipolar world. You got the Western democracies backed by the United States on one side. You've got the Soviet Union, the Second World, on the other. So it's two different ideologies. Former buddies are now worst enemies. And World War II being over is just going to lead into the tense era known as the Cold War.